Hi, everyone. I'm Hsu Ken, and I'm here with Brian. We're the managing partners at Iterative. Today, we're going to talk about whether you should continue working on your startup, which, in my opinion, is kind of one of the hardest questions founders have to answer. And I think a question that they're constantly thinking about. They may not talk about it very much, but I think it's always kind of in the back of their mind as they're working on it. Um, Brian, why do you think it's kind of like such a difficult question? You and I have had many conversations about this, like on our startups. Why do you think this is so hard?
Yeah. I think maybe the primary reason it's so difficult is because you have to make a very conscious decision, right?
Mm.
Like it's like much easier to continue what you were doing before, which is just iterate and work on your company and talk to users, etc., until your money comes out or runs out, rather than you having to sit down with your co-founders and be like, "Hey guys, this is not working. Things are, I don't know, failing. We're not growing, etc., etc." It just requires so much more conscious effort to do.
And I guess in order to kind of do it, it's just so unpleasant, right? You have to like have this difficult conversation with your co-founders. You have to kind of like, there's a whole sunk cost fallacy part of it where it's like, you kind of have to admit to yourself that you spent a bunch of time kind of working on this thing and it's not going.
Yeah,
Like, the whole process
yeah,
is so unpleasant.
yeah.
Um,
Yeah. It's also maybe other interesting thing is like it is exactly the opposite of the best attributes of entrepreneurs. Right? The
mm,
best attributes of most entrepreneurs are to like stick it out, be super gritty,
optimism.
persevere,
Yeah.
right? Like optimism, etc. And you're like going against your nature to figure out whether you need to like shut down your company. And it's also like incredibly tied to your own ego, right?
Yeah.
And so it makes it doubly hard to have these conversations.
Yeah, and I feel like there's probably a bit of this that makes it feel like if you are pondering these questions, like I mean, imposter syndrome is like a thing that people talk about all the time, and I wonder if that kind of triggers some imposter syndrome because you're like, oh man, it's all these companies that kind of stuck it out, and like, but I think we should kind of stop, and so you kind of feel a little bit like you should stick it out more because you kind of heard all these stories of that's what founders are supposed to do. Do you think that's a
Yeah,
thing?
that's totally a thing, right? Because like all of us are reading startup
Yeah.
books, right? Where it's like, oh, this Pinterest uh, or what's another good example? I think
Airbnb. I
like
feel like
Airtable's
Airbnb is the like
Airbnb.
it's the canonical example, right? It's like that's
Yeah,
the example.
yeah,
Yep.
yeah. It was not working for 5 years, 6 years. All of a sudden, something happened, and it kind of like blew up. Maybe if I waited 2 or 3 years, right, something's gonna happen. It's gonna blow up. So uh,
Which is tricky because people just don't write stories about the companies that stuck it out for those 5 years and then they didn't turn into anything, right? And like that's actually more case. Like Airbnb is the exception, not the rule, right?
yeah,
Um,
exactly.
and so I feel like you and I know a lot of the companies that stuck it out and then did not work. But I think if you're like new to startups and that kind of stuff, you only really hear about the Airbnbs and the Pinterests and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, yeah, exactly, exactly.
Hey, in your opinion, do you think more companies should be kind of like shutting down or pivoting, or do you think more companies should be like sticking it out? Like, given that it's so unpleasant to have this conversation, you could imagine that actually more companies should be pivoting or kind of shutting down. But since it's such an unpleasant conversation, they just kind of keep going for a long time. What is your take? Do you think more people should actually kind of like have these unpleasant conversations?
Uh, I 100% think people should have these conversations, right? Because
Mm,
like everyone's already thinking about it and you should go into it. I think that's different than should your company
mm.
shut down.
Yep.
Uh, and so I'm curious what you think. Like,
A- And maybe for people who we should maybe define kind of pivots and shuttings down and all that kind of stuff, right? Pivoting is like it's still the same company, it's still the same co-founders. You're just working on something kind of like totally different. The way that I define pivoting is like you're working on a new problem. I feel like sometimes I've heard startups talk about they're pivoting, but they're just actually working on the same problem, but they have a different product. And to me, that's not pivoting. Pivoting is like you working on a completely different problem, right? It's not a different solution for the same problem; it's a different problem. And then shutting down is you are returning whatever money's left, you're closing the entity, everybody kind of part ways and that kind of stuff, right? So there's like a difference here. um, I think this is such a nuanced question, and you and I have had a lot of conversations about this. I feel like there are some companies that shut down and you and I are like, I feel like they should have stuck this out a little bit more, right? They should have stuck it out, they should have like worked on their problem more, and they gave up a little bit too early. But I think on balance in a macro view, especially for very early stage companies and founders, I feel like they probably should be kind of like pivoting more. Um, I think especially for first time founders, when you're kind of like working on an idea, like I don't know, the first 3 or 6 months, you're basically pivoting all the time, right? And I think sometimes people think about the first 3 to 6 months when you're working on a startup. It's like you pick a thing and then you have to kind of just like do it for kind of like a long time. And I think that's how you and I started out. Remember, our first company was like Xpro. It's like it was like 18 months, 2 years of just like trying to make this thing work. And then we went into this mode where we're like changing ideas every week. And so I think that's my advice to people. I think is kind of like would be that is if you're kind of early on, like I would be pivoting quite a lot to like try to find like signs that something is going to kind of work. But I don't know. Do you agree? Kind of disagree?
I mean, 100% agree because we work together on these companies. Maybe another kind of like framework for people
Yeah.
is typically you have some runway.
Mm,
Your runway is basically like your time for experimentation. One way to think about it is rather than kind of like, hey, we're gonna keep on going until a runway runs out. It's like how many experiments can I
mm,
try? Of kind of like what degrees. So you could be like, hey, I'm gonna chop it in half. So 6 months of like this one problem, and then 6 months of like completely different thing, and then you can chop those down into kind of like 2 week experiments into that single problem. But kind of like what you're saying, right? Which is the most important thing is actually to have these conversations and to have a framework for when
mm.
you would make certain decisions or moves about your company.
Actually, that's a good point because I feel like when I mean those first 2 years you and I were working together, we were not getting anywhere, and I think it changed quite a lot when we were much more structured about like the exploration phase, where we are like, we're going to work this much time on this thing, right, and then we're going to do this other thing, and so we were kind of like, and we started setting goals. Do you remember this? It was like before we're like, we're going to launch this thing, and then we'd get like 300 signups and I would be like, oh my gosh, that's amazing. And you'd be like, that's horrible. And then we would like
Yeah,
argue about whether that was good or bad. And I think then we started doing like before we launched, it's like, okay, Hsu Ken, what are your expectations? Brian, what are your expectations? And then we kind of talk about it before and then we can actually see what happens and we can be like, okay, this was less or more than we thought. So I think
yeah,
structure around kind of like how to think about this before you start is probably important. Um,
yeah.
Maybe some level of nuance for people here though, there are some ideas that just take a long time to figure out and there's some that don't. Like I feel like you were working on Divi for like quite a while in those early stages and that's just an idea that took a lot of time. Like you weren't going to figure that out in a week, right? So like there's a lot of nuance with this.
There's definitely a lot of nuance, but I want to say like 99% of the time you can figure things out in a week.
Mm,
Uh, like with when we started Divi, it wasn't even close to what it was now,
yeah.
right? Like we went through 12 different ideas. We talked to a bunch of users. We did experimentation. We built prototypes, et cetera, and we had this framework for kind of like what's going to work, what's not going to work. The things that take a long time to, or I think this is the thing. It doesn't take that long to figure out customer pain points,
Yeah.
right? Because you can always talk to customers. It takes a really long time to figure out economics,
Mm,
right? Like uh, your CAC, your LTVs, your churn rates, your retention, etc.
yeah.
And so those types of things will take, I don't know, a quarter at
Yeah.
least,
At
right,
least.
for you to kind of something to play out. But are you solving someone's problem? Like you can figure that out in like
Yeah.
weeks.
A-
Um,
And to be honest, I feel like for most early stage startups, that's actually the question that they're trying to answer is are you solving a problem that like people have, right? The economics is the
yeah,
question you get to ask yourself after you figure out that first one. But the
yeah,
majority of startups, at least that you and I work with at Iterative, are like in that first bucket, right?
yeah, yeah. And sorry, this is like some semi tangent, but like the most important question to answer is actually, are you solving the most important problem that this
Mm,
person has?
yeah.
Um, right, because it's like we see this all the time. Probably the majority of the companies that we're talking to are solving a problem,
Yeah.
but they're solving a problem that's probably number five, number six,
Yeah.
etc. of like someone's list. Yeah,
Yeah. I feel like, I mean, I would phrase it maybe different. It's like, it needs to be a sufficiently big problem, right? I mean, sometimes it's like
yeah,
it's not their biggest problem, but it needs to be sufficiently kind of like big problem, right? So I think
yeah,
that's kind of the like piece here. Okay, maybe
Yeah.
let's go to this next part. I feel like we're starting to talk about this already. What are the
Yeah.
signs that somebody should continue working on their startup? And I had kind of this debate around there's signs you should continue, but there's also signs that you should not continue. So we can kind of mix both in here. Um, I wrote this thread, and this will just give us a baseline, and we'll go off in lots of tangents. But basically, let me go through kind of the three parts that I wrote. And you and I haven't talked about this, and so I'm curious what your take on what I think is. For everybody out there, Brian and I don't agree on everything, and so we have kind of lots of heated conversations about this. So I'd be curious kind of what he thinks. Okay, so the three questions I kind of like was recommend to people that answer this question is the first one is around growth, like are you growing, and are you growing sufficiently kind of like fast? So in our batch we try to have companies grow 5 to 7% every week, which is 12.6x and 33x kind of annually. To me, I'm kind of like growth is the best kind of like indicator that you're probably onto something. But what do you think? Is this kind of like on your list of things that matter when you're like working on when you're like thinking about continuing to work on something?
100%. Right. You're looking for demand for your product. And so demand comes in the form of growth. It comes in the form of, I mean, early on when you don't have a product, it's just like user studies, right?
Yeah,
Do people
yeah,
really, would they pay for it? All this kind of stuff. But yeah, the, it's also such a morale booster, right?
yeah, yeah.
When you're like every single week your numbers are going up, you're like, oh, okay, maybe I'm like onto something. And so clearly a sign you should, yeah, clearly a sign
Yeah,
you should keep
it's.
working on.
I think in
Yeah.
sports, it's like winning kind of like solves all your problems, and in startups, it's like growth solves all your problems. It's like you could honestly have a horrible relationship with your co-founder, but if you're like growing fast, it's kind of okay. Like you're just like,
Yeah.
like we're growing fast, so like it kind of doesn't matter.
Yeah,
How do
exactly.
you think about the speed of growth? Because I think that's something that we talk about a lot. It's like if you're early stage, you should actually be growing much faster than 5 to 7%. Like, how do you
Yeah,
think about the like benchmarks for speed on this?
yeah. I mean, we work with very very early companies, right?
Yeah.
So in the very very early days, you have to figure out some metric where it's 10xing. So your GMV is 10x in the year, and typically that maps to your kind of like 3 to 5 or 5 to 7% weekly. But for companies that are doing more like B2B sales, right? It's like how do I go from 100K ARR to a million in ARR in the span of 1 year. And I think people know this because they're listening to us, VCs, right? If it doesn't grow at that rate, it's just not interesting
Yeah.
as like a VC backed company. It could be a great company, but it's not a VC backed company. So again, I feel like you run into this all the time with founders. Have you seen them uh, struggle with kind of like the growth rates?
Yeah, I think so. And look, I kind of empathize because it's not obvious, right? There's no like set rubrics where it's like, okay, you're this stage of company, you should be growing this fast. And if you're this stage, like just no rules to this, right? Even the 5 to 7% is like guidelines for roughly the companies kind of in our batch. So I think it's challenging for people. Um, my shorthand actually now for like what is really fast growth, and this is kind of a joke, but kind of not a joke, is you're growing really, really fast when you think your metrics are wrong. Like I feel like there's been times when we were growing and it was kind of like we look at the chart and we're like, it can't be that fast. Like somebody go look to see if we have a bug. And like if you are
Yeah,
looking at your analytics to see if you have a bug, you are growing sufficiently fast, right? I mean, there's a company in
yeah,
our batch right now where you straight up just didn't believe them, right?
yeah,
You were like, there's no way they're growing that fast. And the more you dug in, it
yeah,
turns out that they kind of like are. Um, so I think there's a piece of that. Maybe one thing for everybody listening to why this is important is if you are really onto something and nobody else has kind of been doing it, um, the market is wide open for you, right? So if you are solving a sufficiently kind of like big problem for people and you're the first one to kind of do it or you have a kind of novel solution, the market is like all open for you. And so on some level you should be able to like if you come in and like have that right thing, you should grow fast because like people haven't used this kind of thing before, right? And so it's kind of like I don't know, everybody is super thirsty and you're the first person to show up with water, it's like everybody is going to drink the water, right? And so I think it's like if you are not growing that fast, then it's kind of like, okay, is the market not that big? Do you kind of not quite have it right? Like that kind of stuff. And so I think about that on some level. one regret I kind of have maybe when I wrote this thread is I think retention is actually pretty important here. Like we've seen a lot of companies that grow really fast and then they have bad retention, and like that's not a good sign. So I don't know if I was going to amend this. I feel like retention is an important piece of this. How do you think about the like balance between kind of retention and growth for these early stage companies?
Yeah, I mean, retention is super important, but it also has the kind of like funny, like delayed effect,
Yeah,
right?
right.
Of like 1 month later, and it's very hard to benchmark because you're probably doing something that's kind of like very different than someone else,
Yeah,
and so it definitely is important. It takes longer to kind of like go figure out.
got it.
Yeah,
Cool. Okay. This so first thing that I was looking at was are you growing? The second thing is are you learning? And Brian, you and I kind of like talk about this a lot. And for everybody kind of like inside baseball, which nobody in Southeast Asia watches baseball, but Brian and I, when we're looking at companies and talking to founders a lot, the thing we often say is insights per minute when we're talking to them. Brian, do you want to explain what insights per minute mean and why that's like important to us?
yeah. Maybe it's because we're old and we've seen so many startups,
Yeah.
and so okay, yeah, you feel old. It's good. Yes.
Yes.
One of the things that we look for is when we're talking to founders is are they telling us things that we haven't heard or things that they've learned doing their companies? It turns out it's a really, really good signal of whether a startup is going to be successful because the founders that have the most insights, meaning they're learning the most from their customers, just continue to learn at that pace. And so when we say insights per minute, it's in the like hour conversation that we have in with founders. What is their insights per minute? It's like how many times are we like, oh, that's interesting,
Yeah.
right? And if you get it to be one per minute, most likely you're getting an investment from us.
Yeah, totally. And I think the way that we think about this is if we have I mean, Brian and I are kind of like, we've seen a lot of starts, but like every startup is so deep. And so we have a 30-minute call with you, and we don't actually come out of that call like learning anything about your target users and stuff. That's typically kind of not a good sign, right? Because it's like, we don't talk to your target users. We're not working on this problem. And so I think this is like something that we look at quite a lot. And so I think for people that are kind of like out there and they're like thinking about this, if you're not really learning, if you're working on your startup and you're not really learning about your users, then that's like typically a pretty bad sign that like something is like going on and you're kind of like not in the right spot. The other thing that we talk about a lot is secrets. So Brian and I internally talk about this a lot, which is we think the best startups tend to be built around some secret. And a secret, at least my definition of it, Brian, I don't know if you've ever agreed on a definition of it.
Yeah.
My definition is something that very few people know or something that very few people kind of believe. Um, and I think my canonical example here is like our parents told us never get in a car with strangers, except now everybody gets in cars with strangers like on a regular basis with like Grab and Uber. And so they just believe that it turns out that people want to get in cars with strangers and will kind of like pay for it. So I think that's like the secret that we kind of like build around. Okay, so signs you should continue working on your startup, growth, and then are you kind of like learning about your users? And then the third one for me was, do you have ideas on what to do next? And what I mean by this is I feel like when Brian and I have started companies, we cannot shut up about how many ideas and things we want to try related to this startup. So if Brian and I, when we were kind of starting companies, it's like X problem. We're like, oh, we can build this and we can do this and we can like do this and we can kind of try all these things. And I've also had conversations with Brian when we're like 2 years into a startup and we're like, and it's like, let's say it's not going that well. And we're like, okay, so what do we do now? And Brian and I kind of look at each other and we're like, I don't know. What do you think we should do? Right. And we kind of just ran out of ideas. And so I think this is like a sign for me that like you're onto something when you kind of have like a lot of ideas for something. And then if you're kind of like you don't have ideas for what to do next, it's typically kind of like a bad sign. Brian, do you think about this way? Is ideas kind of a thing that kind of makes your list?
100%. I almost think about the opposite way,
Hmm.
or the exact same thing, but kind of like the reverse,
Inverse, yeah.
which is if you, what is the best signal to look for to shut down your company?
Oh,
And the best signal to look for, I think, is this, right? Which is like
mhm.
you've now run out of ideas for how to sufficiently solve a problem that you were kind of like going after in the first place. And I think it's a really good signal because it's really clear.
Mm.
Like when you sit around the table with your co-founders or when you're there by yourself, you're like exhausted. You're like scraping the bottom of the barrel with like, what else can we do? You're like crying in the corner. You're like, okay, I can do these things, right? But there may be like a 1% lift in like some conversion rate. You're like, is that even like worth my time? And so
Yeah.
it's like a very distinct, I don't know, time during your startup. Yeah, where
Yeah.
you're like, you have no inspiration anymore.
That's a good point because I feel like you can kind of like we've seen founders talk themselves into that they're growing fast enough, even though we don't think they're growing fast enough. And I've seen founders talk themselves into that they're learning quite a lot, even though we don't think they're learning a lot. So it's kind of easier to kind of delude yourself on some level that you're kind of doing this thing. But the idea is when it's hard to delude, it's like, do you have ideas for what to do next or not?
Yeah,
And maybe the way to think about it is startup growth doesn't just happen. It isn't just like, oh, keep doing the same things and you're going to all of a sudden kind of get growth and your startup's going to make it. It's like we always think about engineering growth, I think is the word we use, where it's like you are not growing. If you want to grow 10x faster, you got to like figure out something to do that will help you grow 10x faster. And so if you just run out of ideas to kind of like do this. So I think the three things here is signs you should continue working on your startup: growth, learning, and then kind of like ideas for what to do next. Brian, anything you would add here? I also want to flip very quickly to just like we can just like rattle off like signs you should probably stop working on your startup. I think that'd be like an interesting thing. But anything else you would add to
yeah.
like you should continue, and then we'll flip over to the other side.
Uh, I feel like it's a strange thing to say, but the more that we've done this, I feel like it's such a good indicator. It's just, are you having fun?
Yeah, yeah,
Um, yeah, because I think it's so much
that's a big
easier
thing.
to, yeah, and it comes. I think it's maybe kind of like the blend of all these, right? Like when you're having fun, typically you're learning quite
Yeah,
quickly. When you're having fun, typically you're like trying all these
yeah,
things and you get results. A lot of times, even if you're trying things and kind of like they don't pan out the way you've learned
it's kind of
something,
fine.
and so
Yeah,
it's like still fun.
yeah,
And so I don't know if it's like maybe it's like not quantitative enough, but I often look for like just are you having fun? And it's funny because we can tell, right? Like
yeah,
when we're on calls with founders, we're like, this guy or gal is clearly burnt out, not
yeah.
having fun, and they're trying to raise money, and it doesn't matter what you say. We're like, nobody's going to give you money, right? Because
Yeah.
it's like you're not. Yeah,
Yeah, it's almost kind of like when you see it on their face, it's almost like their startup weighs them down rather than kind of picks them up, right? You see some people
yeah,
and they're just like, "Oh my gosh." You can almost see in their face they're like, "Why did I pick this idea? It's been so hard." Like
yeah,
and it just like weighs them down. It like physically feels like you're kind of like weighing them down. So I actually think this is a really good addition. Like that "Are you having fun" thing is kind of like really important. It's like the more fun you have, the more resilient you're going to be, and so you can just like weather this stuff, right?
yeah,
um,
yeah,
I think if there's actually, Brian, I feel like for our companies, if there was anything that kept us going, it was probably having fun. It was probably nothing else. Like we just kind of
yeah,
had fun trying to start stuff. And so I don't think it was actually really anything else that kind of like motivated us, right? It wasn't money, it wasn't kind of any of that stuff. I think we just had fun. um,
yeah.
Okay, fun, underrated. Why you should continue your startup. Okay, maybe we don't have to go as deep, but maybe just like quick
Yeah.
signs that you should stop working on your startup. Okay, one, if you're not having fun anymore, you should you should probably stop working on it, right? But I think it's just like different.
Let's caveat. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, you do the caveat. Yeah, you do the caveat.
No, I would caveat with some time frame, right? Because it's like it's very
Yes.
easy not to have fun in like a day period, maybe even like a week period.
Week
But if it's
period.
like been a month and it's like grueling, there's no day in the month where you're like, oh, you're waking up and you're like, I
Yeah.
should be working on this. Something's wrong. Yeah,
Yeah, that's a good caveat because it's not like startups are not like fun every day, right? They're not even fun every
yeah.
other day. They're like a lot of work, and so um, I think that's like a good caveat. Okay, other signs you should not be working on your startup.
You're running out of money, or not running out of money, running out of ideas
Yeah,
to test.
yeah,
Um,
running out of
very, very
ideas.
clear. Um, I mean, we didn't talk about this, or maybe it's kind of on the growth thing. Like there are great founders in very bad markets.
Yeah.
And you'll tell that, I think, with your growth, right? Meaning it's too small. There's not enough people who are willing to pay for it. There's not enough people, period, who want this, right? And so, um, kind of like slow growth could mean small market.
I also feel like sometimes when startups are kind of like in trouble and not doing well, they just like none of their users want to talk to them, right? Like they
Mm,
can't talk to anybody, right? And this is kind of harsh, but during the batch, I think you and I are often talking. They're like, "Hey, why won't any of these people talk to me?" And part of us is like, I mean, there's other reasons, but the like elephant in the room reason is like they don't really care about the thing you're solving, and so it's like not worth their time to kind of talk about it. Whereas I feel like if we've seen startups where it's like everybody wants to talk to them and like they give you feedback kind of like whether you ask for them or not and that kind of stuff. It's not, I don't think it's like a, if people don't want to talk to you, you should definitely shut down your startup. It's not like, I don't think there's any one thing that is like, if this is the case, you should like shut down. I don't think that's the case, but I do feel like the startups that are kind of struggling more, they have a very hard time kind of like getting feedback from their like users or customers or like that kind of stuff.
yeah. And just for people that haven't like experienced this, the reverse happens when you're kind of like onto something. Your customers cannot stop talking to
They
you
cannot.
about how much your product sucks, right? They're like complaining and asking for features, but they still continue to use you. And so you have this like massive cumulative volume of customer support tickets of like rabid users.
Yeah, sometimes I feel like people have like found my email. Like I don't have an email anywhere, and they just like found my email just to like email me about kind of like this thing, right? And it's like, wow, you like went out of your way to like tell me you wanted this thing, which is
Yeah.
kind of like typically a pretty good sign here too. Okay, maybe I'll move to the next part. Okay, so we've talked about signs for when you like should continue working in a startup, not to continue working in a startup. Let's kind of like make this practical for people. How do you know what to do next? So maybe you've kind of seen some of these signs. What do you do now? I think the way that I was thinking about this and I think this is how we end up thinking about startups is like learnings kind of generate new ideas or kind of bets, and then those generate kind of growth. And so there's this kind of like you learn about customers, you come up with new ideas on what to try, and then those things kind of like generate growth. And so you can almost, if you have that as a frame, you can almost kind of debug like what's happening with your startup. But maybe let me pause a bit, Brian. Does this learning kind of like bets growth thing kind of make sense to you?
I think it's so good. You should just keep going.
Okay. Um, and then I think it's so, and maybe we'll put this up in as part of the podcast or something. But I basically made this table of kind of like what are all the different things if you're kind of like missing it and stuff. Um, Brian, maybe a good place to kind of jump into this is what do you think is the hardest part? Do you think people have the hardest time, and based on our work at Iterative, the hardest time getting learnings, the hardest time turning those learnings into bets, or the hardest time turning those bets into growth? Where do you feel like people are kind of like are most challenged?
uh, Okay, to be completely honest,
Yeah.
I think it's none of them. Like
Oh, really?
typically, yeah, typically what happens, I think, and I'd love your opinion on this
Yeah.
because, again, this is Southeast Asia specific. We talked to so many founders. It's that it's that you are working on the other stuff, right? You're working on like
Mm,
building your MVP, and you're like, oh, I'm
mm,
learning because I'm building my MVP, or like, oh, I need to figure out how to like file taxes. This doesn't happen, but it's like I had
yeah,
to learn how to like do all my like back office
yeah.
accounting, whatever, right? And I need to figure out how to like hire a co-founder. So there's like all this like extraneous stuff that happens, and the time that you're spending on learning, bets, and growth is like 10% or less,
Mm.
maybe like 5% of less. Uh, yeah,
Do
good.
you, do you feel like that ratio is different in San Francisco? Do you feel like people are spending more time on learning bets and growth in San Francisco? And is that kind of your observation between the two?
I I think so, but I also don't want to like overgeneralize because
Yeah,
there's obviously kind of like people that are doing
yeah.
things differently in each place. I do feel like there's again like more of like a startup culture, right? Of like people doing it, and you're what you end up doing is you end up emulating people who do things around you, right? Like
Mm.
successful founders who do things around you, and just because there's so many more founders who care about learnings, distributions, users. You cannot stop hearing about this, right? At like coffee shops, and you end up doing that. And so maybe it's kind of like a learned behavior.
Well, what do you think is the right distribution? Like how much of like if you could magically create startup founders in a lab, what percentage of
Yeah,
the time do you think they should be working on learning bets and growth?
100%.
Yeah, okay, that was my answer too. It's like everything, nothing else matters. This is the only thing that matters, right? Like
Yeah,
if you don't get this right, especially I feel like especially in the early stage. I mean, later stage, I think this changes a little bit, but in the early stage, it's like you should just be spending 100% of your time trying to like learn from your users, turning those learnings into kind of like ideas or bets for growth, and then like growing. And everything
yeah,
else kind of like doesn't matter that much.
yeah, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I feel like people should just spend 100% of their time on this.
Yeah, it's like we can talk more about like learning expensive growth, but it's like the higher level for me is like how do you minimize the time you're working on everything else and then
Everything else.
maximize the time you're working on this, right?
Yeah.
And so if you're coding, stop coding. Like use no code, I don't know stuff, right? If you're not
Yeah.
talking to users, go talk to users. If you, I don't know, if you're trying to figure out your like accounting, hire an accountant, right? There's like much more higher leverage stuff that you should be doing at the very early days than a lot of what people are doing now.
And maybe just to kind of add on to that bit a little bit, the founders should be working on this, right? Like this
Yeah,
is only founders can work on this, and so founders should be kind of spending their time. Founders don't need to be doing accounting. They don't need to be worrying about kind of like on all of that kind of stuff. They should be just focused on kind of like this specifically. Um,
yeah.
I feel like in
Uh, Sorry, Sukan.
yeah,
I feel so passionate about this because
yeah,
I see it wrong all the time. I need to like voice
yeah,
a, a very good example of an early trap here is also sales,
yes,
team
yes,
building, right?
yes,
So people are like, oh, I got this, people want my product. And then all of a sudden they're like, how do I hire like 10 salespeople to like talk to, or like BD people or whatever? Like you're like prematurely growing sales.
yeah,
And oftentimes you see the founders then like remove themselves away from talking to customers. And uh, you don't realize this. 3 months in, 6 months in, you now don't have the like feedback channel anymore.
yeah.
And so you're going in a direction that's probably completely wrong for your company. And so, yeah, very, very easy early trap to fall into.
I just want to double down on this and like
Yeah.
overlay it on top of it on the learnings bets growth thing. If the founder is not doing sales, your salespeople are not going to be able to kind of like get the same learnings as the founder, and frankly, they're not kind of paid to like do that. And so, like, if you are a founder and you are not doing sales in the early days yourself, you are not getting the learnings that you could be getting. And if you're not getting the learnings, then you're not coming up with ideas on how you can grow in any of the bets, and then you're just not going to grow, right? And so it's like a very kind of structural piece. Like if you aren't learning about your users, like nothing else at your startup is going to work, right? Like you don't get a pass go, you don't collect $200 or whatever in Monopoly. Like if you don't have learnings, none of this kind of like matters. Um, and so we work with this and the people in the batch, but founders should definitely be doing sales. They should be doing the kind of like customer support and all that. You want to be as close to learnings as possible, just because you need to be able to like do that to kind of get everything else. Um, Brian, I feel like when we're working with the batch, it's like a very easy tell of like whether this company is going to be successful or not based on like how close the founders are to kind of this. You and I sometimes talk about we're like, oh man, this company is they're in like company building mode too early, and it's exactly what you're saying where they just started hire. Their like full time job is like hiring lots of people instead of like learning about their customers, and like we're almost always going to be like, yeah, the startup's probably not going to go anywhere.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Do you want to briefly go over this table so when you post it for people,
yeah,
you can kind of tell? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's like there's like so many kind of different kind of
Yeah.
variations of it, right? But maybe kind of the high level parts that people kind of like think about and if they find themselves in these situations. Okay, so if your company isn't growing, then you basically want to spend time looking at like whether you're learning the right things about your customers and whether you're generating the right ideas or bets. So it's like you almost kind of work backwards, right? So if you don't see growth, there's something wrong with what you're learning or kind of like ideas. If you don't know what to do, as in like Brian and I were talking about kind of like, hey, you're running out of ideas and all this stuff, your immediate reaction should just be like, I don't have ideas because I don't understand enough about my customers or users. And so you want to like go talk to kind of users. And again, if you don't feel like you have any learnings, you need to kind of go talk to users. So you almost kind of work backwards. So if you don't have growth, Go talk to users, work and try to figure out if your ideas are kind of the right ones based on your learnings. If you don't have ideas for what to do next, go back and talk to your users. If you kind of don't have learnings, go talk to users. I mean, all of this kind of points to like talk to users. I think is kind of like a big piece that kind of stands out here. Brian, anything you want to add to this? Add to this?
I don't I don't think so. I think talk to users is like definitely the thing here. This might be bad advice for Southeast Asia. In a lot of the Bay Area, a lot of people have tried what you're trying to do
Oh yeah,
most of the time. And
yeah.
so you can also try to tap into other founders
Mm.
who have done similar things or run into similar problems. I think that's the cool thing about having kind of like a founder community around you is oftentimes people have tried similar things to what you're trying, and you can learn a lot from them as well.
Yeah, and I think that actually what's so helpful about iterative kind of being like cohorts is because it's like, I mean, it's just getting people of a similar stage kind of work together and they can kind of compare notes. And we see this in group office hours, right? There's like some companies are growing really fast and some that are slower. And then they're kind of like, okay, what are you guys doing? So they can debug. But I do think that's an underrated thing is like just having kind of like other founders around you so that you have that kind of like perspective and kind of surface area.
Yep.
All right. I think that's a good place to stop, Brian. So, what our primary conclusion here is go talk to users, which I
Yes.
guess is not that revolutionary thing. Um, okay, so takeaway here is learnings generate bets, bets generate growth. That all kind of leads to kind of talking to users. Thanks, Brian.
Thank you. Until
Okay,
next time.
Brian and I will be doing more of these, so subscribe.